Hello and welcome to our very first episode of the ImproVoice with NPI. I'm your host Shreya, and for our listeners who might be averse to abbreviations, NPI of course stands for Non-Placed Innovas. Joining us in studio for our auditory review is the wonderful Jonah Fazel, actor, comedian.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on the podcast, Shreya.
Woohoo!
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. NPI could stand for all sorts of things, couldn't it? You could be like Nil Poir Ireland, which is a reference to the Eurovision Song Contest and something which will never happen. What else could it stand for?
New parking initiatives.
Yes. No passports implied. How about no pressure improv?
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. No pressure, just let it flow. ImproVoice with NPI.
And we're back to the podcast, ImproVoice with NPI. So, Jonah, we just finished working on an Agatha Christie themed workshop. And back in London, you also work on genre-based productions. Why don't you tell us more about that?
Yeah, Bumper Blyton, or the full name is Bumper Blyton, Improvised Adventures for Grown-Ups. Just to make it clear who is invited to the show and who's not. And
It's only grown-ups.
Yeah, only grown-ups. People with childish imaginations are welcome also. Yes, we've been doing that. It started at the Fringe, the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, which is, for people who don't know, is the largest performing arts festival in the world. And we had lots of fun, lots of success for about 4 or 5 years. And we decided that we wanted to take it all around the UK and also Europe. And we just finished earlier this year our debut tour with that show all around the UK, and in September have our second tour. I was going to say second debut tour, but I don't think that works quite like that.
Is there something in particular that attracts you towards genre-based work?
Well, as an actor, I always wanted to just create improvised theatre. I was saying to you in the workshops the other day, theatre with a capital T. So something which feels like a really slick, professional produced show that is using improvisation as well. And what attracts me to genre, I think it's really fun and can be super silly to take a more of a satirical point of view, to look at contemporary issues, because we reference the news and current affairs in the Enid Blyton musical show. Somehow we get all of those things in, but to look at those sort of contemporary affairs through a slightly skewed lens of these children in the 1940s in Britain somewhere, running around on the hills in little shorts and woolly jumpers as well.
Is there a lot of anachronism there as well? Because you're referencing something that did not happen in the world of those people. So how do you go about directing this and performing this?
Is there a lot of anachronism? Yes, for about 2 hours, and then it's the end of the show. Yeah, that's the whole show is that. Right. Yeah, exactly. How do we go about doing that? I suppose, well, one of the things you need to do if you're really excited about creating genre pieces, whether it's Agatha Christie, whether it's Twin Peaks, whether it's Downton Abbey, whether it's Murder She Didn't Write and all of those things, or Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, which is another show that we're working on, and a Charles Dickens based show that we're also working on at the moment, and lots of all these sort of genre shows, is an obsession and an affection for the source material. But maybe, that affection can't be blind affection, because you need to be able to look at, well, what are the tropes here? What are the things that we can, that feel like we ought to honour in terms of it being more fan fiction,
right.
And what are the things that we really need to be poking fun at and kind of satirising because this is a very old-fashioned point of view or something. But yeah, those classic authors, I mean, they've been published for Agatha Christie for 100 years in her case, and millions of copies sold around the world. So despite any of those sort of slightly old-fashioned problematic aspects of the work, there's something at the core of it, I think, that makes it really exciting, whether that's nostalgia, the sort of rose-tinted glasses of adventures that we all had as children, rolling around in parks and hills and solving crimes and being given sweeties by the police for our good work. So they're always going to be compelling, and I mean, Agatha Christie, for example, which is the workshop we all did together just the other day, is, I think, the one of the most translated authors of all time, one of the most best-selling. So there's clearly something enduring that's worth peeling the layers of and playing with.
Interesting. So you mentioned satirizing old-fashioned points of view. And I feel like when you go about directing that in today's world, it's you have to approach that with a lot of sensitivity. What are some examples of really clever adaptations, for the lack of a better word, that you've come across or have done?
Gosh, that's a very insightful question. Yeah, how have we actually managed it? So I think, one of the things we do is we before we reach any venue in the kind of UK, even though it's obviously a very, very small country, it's like diverse in its opinions and its kind of localities, we make sure we do a little bit of research about the town that we're visiting to include references to that. But in terms of those, I guess you would call sticky or tricky tropes and situations, so if I talk about Enid Blyton, for example, there's a nice example there where I don't think that the author intended this, but in the Famous Five, you have the character of George, who in the parlance of the time is a tomboy, in that she loves doing all the things that boys do, and she's really resistant to being called a girl and finds it really repelling and gets really upset. And it's very clear now the kinds of children that Enid Blyton was thinking about. We have a modern framework for understanding those kinds of feelings and those kinds of sentiments and how we would describe that. And obviously the language for these sorts of things changes all of the time. So how do we deal with those things? Because some of the things you want to satirize and some of the things you want to sort of shine a new light on. We're fortunate that we have a fairly diverse cast in terms of gender, sexuality and things like that. And I think my personal taste is there are some areas that as a comedian I probably won't touch, and I'd but will allow for some of the other members of the cast to kind of play with. So, we have members of the cast who are part of the queer community, and they absolutely love playing versions of that sort of character, or at least taking elements of the idea of not aligning to a particular gender and kind of and playing those tropes, and also poking fun at the morals of the time and the shock and the intrigue by the sort of grown-ups about this behaviour, but also referencing the fact that people are still doing that now in the UK. I think all of these things are still relevant today, and I guess the short answer is do your research. Do your research.
Right.
And try not to, as an improviser, generally play something that you don't hugely identify with or couldn't be identified as, within reason.
Right. I also agree with that, because a lot of the improv that we do comes from who we are and our identity. Even though you're playing different characters, those are mostly extensions of yourself. So it's often easier, better, I wouldn't say easier, but safer. I don't know. I want to say it's safer with the slight caveat that it's not, safer in that don't move out of your comfort zone safer, but it's like this is better for everyone and makes a safer space safer. So it's in that way more advantageous to sort of play characters as an extension of yourself and what you actually identify with and represent your truth.
Yeah, and I think the way to do that through the lens of comedy is to allow is to just allow yourself to react in the way that you would to this situation, and just turn it up a little bit. If it's a spoof or a comedy or a satire or a parody or something like that. And I think audiences laugh at things that are specific, and when we use our, as you're saying, our own truth and our own lived experience through the kind of the filter of this character, those intricacies, those specificities are the things that often get really raucous belly laughs as well, because even though that was incredibly detailed just to you, it's so relatable on like a kind of a wider scale.
Yeah, and I think there was a really nice exercise during the workshop that we worked on where I actually thought about the specifics of it. I believe this was in Stagecraft Essentials, where we had to think about, I think when we were doing the poem. So
right, yeah. So that's it's a really, really lovely exercise. The people may have come across this before. It's a poem template by a poet called George Ella Lyons, that's sort of been around online, I guess, in the spheres of education for a long time, and it's a sort of fill in the blank poem with a few prompts as to what you should put in those blanks. For example, it might ask you to write in this particular place an object that holds particular meaning in relation to your past or something like that, and obviously if you engage with the more poetic, metaphorical kind of language, then without realizing it, you've written something that's incredibly moving, specific and personal, and when you read it back to a partner or out to a group, if you're doing it that way, there's no way people are going to relate to this very specific reference. I think in the poem that I wrote and read a short paragraph of, there's a reference to how when I grew up quite poor in the UK, and we would have an electricity meter that you'd have to put coins in, and you could hear the kind of like dialing down. This is back in the 1980s, so it's very old school. You would have to put a 50 pence piece in the meter, and often people would have 50p's stacked on top of the meter in case you ran out of money and the electricity went off. So I think I referenced that in my poem, which is incredibly niche, random reference that most people under the age of 30 would, even in the UK, would have no idea what you were talking about. But there's some truth to that idea of, the kind of the fear of what are we going to do if the electricity turns off, and so on. And most people's poems were as moving as they were funny as well, which I thought was really important, because comedy is like a great uniter as well. It's a way to talk about experiences and reflect on them, and even the things that can be quite difficult, sad to talk about. Finding a way for you to sort of have fun with it and not take yourself too seriously, I think is important.
I remember when I was doing the exercise, there was this specific reference that I wrote, which when I was writing it, it brought like my heart was up here. And then I wrote this with my truth, but then when I shared this with my partner, she had like a similar continuation of it, and there was like an overlap of a word. So my story ended there, and her story like sort of began from there.
That's amazing. Yeah.
It was a beautiful experience. But you also mentioned the meter, so I have to take a shot at this. Was it called a lecky meter? And this is just for like general knowledge. I'm willing to be corrected.
That is incredible specific knowledge. Yeah, the lecky meter. Yeah.
I just want to say thank you, Arctic Monkeys.
Is that where that's from?
Yeah.
Put 50p in the lecky meter. Yeah. When I grew up, we had a lot of power cuts in the UK, and I remember being in primary school, and they kind of having your dinner off the little plastic plates, and then the lecky would go off, and everyone would go ooh, like you still do now, right?
Yeah.
And then everyone like, put another 50p in the meter, sir.
Yeah.
When you were writing the poem, and I do encourage everyone listening, watching to check it out. Did you find those moments where you can reflect in a warm and kind of, like, funny is not quite the word, but a sort of that warm kind of fun way, or did you feel as though it all had to be sort of quite serious? And
it was a very strange combination, because looking back at childhood is always like I don't know, there's so much nostalgia that the nostalgia brings you warmth, I feel like. So all of those memories that I found as a child may be difficult to deal with. Now I'm just like, oh my god, remember when I had those experiences? And then the character arc that I went through after this. But yeah, it was a very insightful experience, I would say.
Yeah, and I guess it also, that template just gives you a simple structure, and it makes the poem potentially performative as well, which is what we were doing with it. You don't necessarily have to do that. Yeah.
Speaking of structure, when you are directing genre-based productions, do you use the archetypes as structure? Do you use a template/structure that is there in the original show? How do you go about it?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It depends on the genre, how much you need to stick to a particular structure. I think if it's a murder mystery, let's say, for example, there are 50 different styles of murder mystery in the way the plot unfolds. If it is like the Enid Blyton show that we were just talking about, that's a sort of an adventure, I suppose, sort of like a light hero's journey. We found, or many years ago when I started out doing this sort of genre work, you mentioned before the Downton Abbey kind of show and various other genre work that I've done, we found that after a while you can get hamstrung by a format, and the last thing you want to do when admittedly like long form improvised musical genre set in the 1940s, costume drama, all of those things, that's quite a lot already to contend with. So adding this hypothetical we have to hit this note and this note and this note, these kind of objective story beats, we actually found it was a very good training mechanism for the first year or so of the first show that we did together. And then we very, very quickly found that we were being held back by it, and it wasn't allowing us to play as much as we wanted to. And now and I think that's also a thing about narrative shows as well. If you watch a lot of these, is that you can see when the performers are maybe not having as much fun as you would like them to have, because they are plot writing in their head, in the wings or on stage, and the best thing to do is just ditch the plot, ditch the story, stop thinking so linearly, and do a playful scene. I mean, a training in like the improv format Harold is really useful, because it has those baked in group games, almost to take your mind off, am I on scene 3A or 2B, all of that sort of stuff. I find all of that worrying about structure completely gets in the way of play. Ultimately, I suppose it has to become muscle memory, just like your knowledge of the books or the TV show or whatever it happens to be that you're doing. You've to consume so much of the actual novels or TV shows, whatever happens to be, that when we talk about, say, the first thing that comes to you, or say you're obvious, is that your obvious is through the lens of this author or whatever happens to be. You're more likely to adhere to some of those story structures, I suppose, if you're doing it that way. But my advice to anybody who's thinking about doing long form genre narrative work is absolutely, you can use a bit of a format to teach yourself the shape of the show so that it feels to the audience like the book or whatever it happens to be that you're adapting. But as soon as you get on stage, ditch it completely and just play in that world.
There's something that I find very intriguing. You talked about not worrying about the structure too much, and then you went on to talk about the Herald, which when I was just starting improv, I thought of as being really structured because of the different beats and how it's supposed to braid together. So the first couple of Heralds that I did, I was so this was online, so I was in the virtual wings, just thinking, oh hey, this scene is going to do this, and this character is going to go next in this scene. And I was just trying to map it all in my head. But then what happened is I ended up not participating in any of them because I was like, but this was supposed to go this way. Okay, the next scene will go this way. And then that was very different from what was happening. And then I think after a couple of online jams, I just became this person who just switches on their camera with no idea what's going to happen next, which I feel is like the other end of the other extreme end.
Yeah, the Harold is a really tricky one, actually. My personal taste is that I think that Harold is for the rehearsal room and not for the stage. There are many people in Chicago who would probably disagree, and all around the world who would probably disagree. It's a really great tool to, as I was saying before, kind of to teach you sort of narrative shapes. I think there are other tools as well to do that. But you were also talking about the idea of running, I call it running the maths of the scene whilst you're in the wings, virtual wings or otherwise, and you get into that robot headspace of what is the right thing to do. This character must be introduced to this character, what about this person, no, and kind of trying to figure out what's the right thing to do here, and then after the show you reflect and go, oh my gosh, that was just like going back to the beginning of improv when even though the teacher was saying to me, there's no right answer, please just feel free, but you're thinking to yourself, tell me the way to do improv. And it just puts you back in that kind of place, I think, a lot of the time. So which is why it's so important to ditch the structure once you get on stage if you're trying to tell a story, because without those really playful scenes, it's just not going to be as exciting for you, as interesting, as dangerous, as risky. You're not going to surprise yourself ultimately. That
is so intriguing. I totally resonate with the just wanting the answers part, and I think because when I was just starting improv, there was this incessant need in me to sort of know when I'm being funny. Which was, and I recently watched an interview where Bryan Cranston sort of said that as a comic you can't really approach a scene thinking that it's going to be funny. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, there's a part of you that knows mechanically I want the audience to laugh at this point, but you can't do funny. You can only commit to your character's like reality or commit to their truth, and even if they're a really, really silly kind of almost like two-dimensional character, even then just commit to their truth. And we've all had that phrase, commit and then overcommit. Just turn up that kind of dial of how they feel about something. I think that's the key to it really is well, we talk about the platform, that who, what, where stuff, which is a really great kind of grounding in knowing, what's the scene, what the given circumstances and so on. But we often forget the why. And my little rhyme is who, what, where, and why do we care?
Yay.
Yeah, which is kind of puts me in mind of, have my character be affected, have my character care, and if it's a stupid character or a high status idiot or low status wimp or whatever the kind of vibe is of the character, have them care even more than I would ordinarily.
So dial that care up to like a 10.
Start at 11 and go up from there.
So there was something very interesting in the workshop that you mentioned about each person being their own school of improv. So what are some of the schools of improv that you're influenced by, and how have you mashed it all up into the Jonah School of Improv?
All right, I can tackle the first part of that. I kind of started my training with Keith Johnstone, actually. Many years ago, I was basically prodded by a teacher at the time. I was writing an essay on Robin Williams or improv or something like that. I can't remember. Well, you need to read this book. So, okay, read this book. Like, he comes over to England and does classes every now and then. Oh, okay, fine. So it was one of my first improv courses, and obviously, that book has like been hugely influential for millions of people around the world. I'm forever grateful to my experiences with Keith, and obviously, he passed away a few weeks ago from when we're recording this, which is really sad. And it's strange to see your heroes go in a way, isn't it? And then I've done UCB style work as well, and the IO, the Improv Olympic, when they existed, and a few other sort of random teachers from around the globe that have come to London to teach for workshops. I'm a huge fan of people like Patty Stiles, Susan Messing, and I think, how has that filtered into the Jonah Fazel TM style of improv? Well, that's a hard question to answer, because how do you see yourself in third person? What is that? What is the style? I think one of the most important things to me in the workshop room is the environment. And I kind of want the classroom to feel, so this is like the vaguest pedagogical kind of idea, to feel kind of like we're already at a bar together. Like we have that sense of relaxation, that we're already old friends. Even if this is like week 1 of your very first beginner's course, we should have that kind of feel, that it's easy, that it's silly, and that we don't take each other too seriously. And here's a Keith Johnstone story, which I thought was my story, and that only I was aware of this. But I learned, actually, he used to do this all the time to people all of the time. So my first workshop with him was almost 20 years ago, actually. And I suppose he was in his 70s at the time, and he would do things like forget where he'd put his shoes, like lose his notepad, forget your name, even though it was like you've been with them for like weeks, and these sorts of things, which everyone thought, oh my gosh, oh no, he's a little bit old and he's forgotten where his shoes are. And then we came towards the end of the workshop, and he kind of revealed in a way that was the most bizarre, that was all complete BS, that he knew exactly where everything was at all times, and he was entirely aware of a status that people have given him because he's the Keith Johnstone, and was very anti that kind of Western interpretation of the guru, and he didn't want that status, because he doesn't want you to feel like there's an objective truth. And so if you're going, oh, the Keith Johnstone said that I need to do a little bit more of this, a little bit more less of that, then you're going to think, well, that's the objective truth. I have to do that thing, just like we were talking about, like be worrying about like what is the right answer, and he talks about the right answer generator in his books quite often as well. And so it turned out this was all some elaborate clowning prank to make himself look fallible and sort of stupid and low status, so that we would go, oh, he's just a human, he's just some guy, and it worked. And that is, amongst all of the other things that I learned, that wasn't even part of the teaching. That was the thing that I looked at and thought, man, I want to be like that. I want to have the experience and the kind of knowledge, but not for people to take me seriously, because I don't want them to take themselves too seriously. I don't know if it directly answered your question, but that was a long and meaningful anecdote for you about Keith.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to do. See, now I have material for my next question. But no, I find it much easier. I think I was also saying this in a book club reading that we were having at NPI. This was online. But I find it much easier to learn from teachers who are open to making mistakes. And I feel like when I start teaching, if I start teaching, that's probably going to be something that I do as well, like not be afraid to make mistakes, and I'm just like pushing myself to make any mistakes, and also tell at the same time convey that I'm human. But there's also like a fine balance, I feel like, that you have to strike with having that authority, quote unquote, or telling people that you have I'm the boss, but not actually making like that a big deal.
Yeah.
Like
Well, maybe you can be like, look, this is my experience of improv. These are my tastes, and
Right.
this is what I think works from
Exactly.
like my experience. But I'm just one person, and I always encourage students. So one of the companies I work for back home is called Hoopla Impro, and we have lots of different levels that you can take within the kind of the stratosphere of the improv. And I always encourage the students to take each level at least twice. Not that we have failed to teach them everything that we need to, but that I'm going to have a very different way of teaching, or a very different pedagogy than the next teacher, and different kind of experiences. And some things you will say as a teacher that will really connect with somebody, and they'll come up to you after the class and go, "Oh, Shreya, so wise, so wise." And then other people, they'll be like, "Yeah, thanks, bye," at the end of the course. And you want to encourage those sorts of people who maybe aren't quite connecting with your personality or whatever it happens to be. It's like, please, I am not improv. This isn't all that it is.
Right.
Please go and study with somebody else. Go to a different school. Come back. Go forwards. If you can afford it, travel internationally. Go to festivals, and most importantly, see as much improvisation as you possibly can. Because you're very limited by the amount of people in your class and your teacher's experience into what you think can be possible as well. So I guess that's what I mean by become your own improv school. Is you got to make your own mind up about things. There are definitely improvisers out there who I've met and am on friendly terms with, who have a very rigid point of view. Like, it's UCB or nothing kind of stuff. For example, if that's you listening, sorry about that. That's you. And that doesn't make sense to me, because where's the freedom in that? Yeah. Maybe it's coming from like being an actor and a theatre maker kind of background, is you want to create your own work. And there's nothing I love more than like, I call it reskinning, or like changing, editing, tearing up old like short form exercises, or like acting exercises that don't necessarily usually live within improv training, and kind of stitching them back together and making some kind of Frankenstein's monster workshop, which was exactly what we did all day with the Agatha Christie, to come back round to that.
We have created a monster.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you mentioned something about being exposed to as much improv as possible, and I feel like because you're also from a theatre background, I think you can relate to the fact that it's common to a lot of artist works, like artists in general in any field need to get exposure to all sorts of things during they're creating art.
Absolutely. Yeah. Have you ever read the book The Artist's Way? Or have you heard of that? Okay, so it's a book that most people I know have read the first 2 or 3 chapters of.
I am an exception.
Yeah, and you've read 0 chapters of. Yeah, it's and people haven't gotten much further in the book than that. It's a really fantastic book, and people should check it out. The first 2 or 3 chapters. But there's this idea that the way they describe it in the book is the artist's date. You need to, as an artist, you need to take yourself on a date as well. You can't just sit at home and consume Marvel movies and then go up and do an improv show. You have to go to modern art galleries. You have to do, all of these different things, as well as being a people watcher to become a great performer. Having that sort of monocultural kind of point of view is like, I like what I like and I'm not going to do anything else. That's not really going to help you. You
used to go to the theatre a lot before becoming a theatre artist, a theatre maker.
Yeah, I did. Referencing earlier, when I was little and in the town that I grew up in, there wasn't really much theatre. I was, and there wasn't much expectation of going into the performing arts either. So it was a big deal to sort of escape my hometown, as it were, and move to like the London. But I was fortunate that the acting school, the drama school that I went to for 3 years, and then afterwards the university, they were all in London, and as a young person, you get discount tickets on things. So we were encouraged to, but would see something 3 or 4 nights a week in terms of theatre and comedy and so on. So that's, I guess, been ingrained in me somehow, that's part of the job of being a performer, a theatre maker, a producer, is you have to know what's out there, you have to know what's going on, and it's not just enough to have a like side eye at somebody's Instagram and go, oh right, yeah, they're doing a play, yeah, okay, whatever. Like go and see the stuff, especially the stuff that that you probably feel like you wouldn't enjoy as well, because you can learn as much from that as things that you like. And I think it's a bit like watching a magic show in a way. This is a really strange metaphor. Like when you watch a magic show and you don't really understand what happened, you're just sort of dazzled by it. You haven't learned anything from that. You're just like, wow, how did they do that thing? And then you go home and it's like, oh, it must have been magic, whatever. But seeing new work, I think, is really important as well. Stuff which isn't quite finished, stuff that isn't quite polished. So yeah, I like to go to scratch nights and works in progress and Edinburgh Fringe previews for comedians and things like that. And that is kind of my artist's date, is you've got to take your imagination on a date.
I love that process. So what happens when you're exposed to art that you don't necessarily agree with or you don't particularly enjoy? How does it go from being art that you don't enjoy into impacting your the art that you create?
Even something that you don't enjoy, it's going to raise some questions, even if that question is, why the hell did they do that? Or what are they thinking? I think some of the stuff that I wouldn't enjoy, as comedians, we've got a fairly low tolerance for irony, I suppose. And sometimes I'm watching a piece which is maybe a little bit too self-involved, and you're sort of looking around at other audience members as if to say, like, right, this is ridiculous, right? Do they know that this is ridiculous?
I can't be the only one.
Yeah. And then everybody else is scratching their chin going, And what can you learn from that? Well, one, you can learn that Jonah is a snob. And other things is, what are the things that made that uncomfortable or boring for me? Or why didn't I connect? And I think the bane of being a maker, performer, etc., is that when you do go to see other live performance, it is really difficult to switch off that kind of critical analysis part of the brain of like, okay, how would I have done that? Or how did they achieve that effect with the lights? Or how does this work? And an improv shows even more so, because we understand the cogs and the workings, and you hear in London, if we're watching like an improv show on a Friday or Saturday night, and the improvisers who are in the team who are about to go on, we're sort of squeezed into the back of the room. The audience are laughing at one thing, which is the joke, and then there's like a laugh from the improviser at the back being like, yeah, where we're like recognizing like clever things that the other improviser has done, or like techniques when they've overcome something. Like, I don't know, somebody asked a question in a scene at the beginning, and then within half a second they auto-corrected their mind and turned that into a statement, and you have that little, yeah, nice work, yeah, good one. There's no reason to not see stuff that you would disagree with, because everything is going to kind of enrich you, and particularly as a comedian as well, like you want to be poking fun at the stuff that you find a little bit pretentious and ridiculous and all the rest of that.
Critiquing things that you find not so cool.
Yeah, critiquing is a much more grown-up way of saying what I just said. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yes, critiquing.
Thank you. But no, during the progression of a course or production, what are some of the development arcs that your productions have gone through, and how have they dealt with real-time influences?
Okay, so we're talking about a production of a piece of theatre or improvised
even
theatre.
like a course that you've taught.
Oh, okay.
Both.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of, being a teacher, you know what you want to achieve by the end of the session in terms of the skills that you need to impart, but you don't necessarily need to have an entirely plotted out trajectory of how to get there. And all the time, I find myself just influenced by the class that I'm teaching, really. And if a particular exercise went really well, or if a particular exercise felt a bit tricky, it's thinking, okay, rather than sit here for 5 minutes and completely analyse why with people who have played this for the first time, let's try a similar exercise from a different point of view. And yeah, I've definitely had sessions where I felt, okay, the plan was the plan, but that's not what we need right now. In terms of productions that I've put on, the one that has the longest running show that I've been part of is the Enid Blyton comedy show, right? That's been, I think, 6 or 7 years or something like that for that one show, with roughly the same cast for all of those years. And it's changed by virtue, again, of who the audience is. So it started off as what we imagined to be a children's show for the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and we had some fun with it, but we realised that actually our tastes were that we wanted to do something that maybe wasn't always appropriate for children. And because I felt if you're doing an Enid Blyton children's show, you sort of are probably likely to stick closer to the source material, and you can't play with the satirical notes as much as we wanted to. And then we said, okay, so all right, maybe it's not that show, maybe that's the wrong audience. And then we kind of retooled it, reworked it, and then for a newer audience, which was more of a kind of grown up kind of fringe theatre comedy nerd kind of audience. And we're like, yeah, this is great, this is more like it. And then we finally got to the stage where the show was like a fairly commercial hit, and we were approached to take it on like a huge kind of UK tour, and then we realised, oh, hang on, no, it's not that show that we were doing. We need to do this needs to be as good as something, or as consistently funny as something that people would choose to watch on television. Because particularly after the pandemic, and with financial issues in the UK at the moment, if people are coming out to the theatre, like, you've really got to make it worth their while. And I think you really owe it to them to give them the thing that they've paid for, in a way, which is a crisp, slick, almost, I'd say, like, sometimes this word gets a bit of flack, but a mainstream kind of comedy show, something which you could see on the BBC effectively. So yeah, I think that progression of that show has changed because we've just encountered different audiences, and particularly when you're playing in these large theatres in the UK, the more clowny aspects that we used to really enjoy about the show don't land as well. We find that actually the audiences maybe are more inclined to enjoy the satire, the verbal wit, and kind of strong characterization stuff. So I think it's continually developing, and it will probably continue to. And as I say, we've got other shows that we're after this tour that we're doing, September onwards, we've got other genre shows that we're going to be doing as well, and hopefully touring those a bit more internationally as well. Things that are maybe slightly less niche than English children's author from the 1930s. Like, for example, a Victorian author from the 1800s.
Yes.
Yeah.
Less niche.
Yeah, much less niche.
So there are two things that I want to speak to here. A, which is slightly more recent in the conversation. You mentioned that you had to adapt your production to something that was something like similar to television, which is
not aesthetically.
Right.
I guess I mean tonally.
Right.
So there would be. It needed to feel less to be honest, it just needed to feel more professional, more slick, and less like something which you would see at a fringe comedy festival. Fringe comedy festivals and improv audiences are incredibly forgiving, and incredibly warm, because most people there are either also performers or are really enjoying the process of seeing you not quite nail it every time, but the thrill of when you absolutely do. But you know, our audience is effectively people our age and our parents' age, and if they're paying, you know, the equivalent of £25, which is a lot of money in the UK for a ticket, it needs to be it needs to be tight, I suppose. Yeah. So yeah, it's about the tone, the tonal shift, and the types of jokes that we find ourselves coming up with in the show.
Noted.
Also, I just thought of this. It never used to be a musical either. There used to be the possibilities of songs, maybe, and we have live musicians that play along with us, and we always have. But this current version of the show, it's like, oh, right, yeah, audiences love an improvised song, no matter who they are. So we don't have this as a rule, because rules don't help improv. But and a thing that I've say many times in my workshops is end on a kiss or end on a song. Because those are the big kind of cathartic moments that the audiences want, that kind of a lovely big moment at the end. Yeah, exactly.
I think you mentioned something about giving distance to the source material and the actual performance in order to bring about satire, which is something, so this is less of a question, more of a comment, that I personally find very fascinating, because I find it very tempting to do satire, like I really want to, but I also at the same time still am yet to understand the finer nuances of a good satire.
Well, one of the best ways to get there is just to consume so much of that kind of the media and books and so on. I think a large amount of the comedy that I grew up on as well, that I really loved and just like binged all the time when I was younger, were things like there's a show called Brass Eye by writer-director called Chris Morris, who also directs movies now as well, which are kind of satirical pieces. And Alan Partridge as well, which is a famous British character, is another kind of satire of a type of British idiot. But it's about taking a sort of ridiculous point of view, I suppose. Ridiculous point of view, but treating it with like dead sincerity. That's not the solution to doing great satire improv, but that's like a starting point, I suppose. Yeah.
And also because I think the reason that I find satire improv also a little bit difficult is that it's improvised, so you can't go back and rehash what you had in mind and like rework that. So you have to literally go with what your first draft is on stage and commit to it. So yeah, but fortunately you've got 4, 5, 6 other people on stage to share with the burden of that. Yeah but right.
That doesn't make you feel better about it, does it?
Yeah, it makes me feel really guilty that they have to share the burden now. Earlier in the conversation, like we spoke a little bit about having freedom or letting the students have freedom of thought. And what are some similar things that you
other little sneaky tricks? What are the things? So I mentioned about the questions thing, I think, as well, is that, you know, questions have to happen in an improv scene at some point. But try not to have them at the beginning of your scene. If you hear a question come out of your mouth, autocomplete that question, turn it into a rhetorical question. There's difference of saying, like, here's the world's least useful improv offer, that if I walk into the scene with you, I'm like, hey, what are you doing? And now I put all the responsibility on your shoulders, right? Like, oh, thanks, Jonah. Now I've got to do
fighting
all the work.
Fighting a leprechaun.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you'd be fine with it, yeah. But all you have to do is say, hey, what are you doing? cogs were, because you know that you're not supposed to be here in this podcast studio after midnight, or whatever. And then all of a sudden we've got the suggestion of like illicitness. We know what time it is, all of that. And so that's one of my favorite tricks. But what I tend to, in a very jovial, lovely, kind way, shout at my students from across the room is, answer your own fucking question. Which is
jovial.
Yeah, yes. Exactly. Yes, in a nice, jovial, gentle way. So that's one thing. I also think that it's worth recognizing that improv does a particular thing to our body, and as experienced improvisers, we've seen lots and lots of performances. And I feel that it's true that a lot of people would assume that improv has a particular style or tone to it, which is the quite fast-paced and this sort of thing, because what's happening inside our body is influencing what's coming out of our mouths. And so the other thing would be just breathe, take some time, and focus on the space work first, rather than any of the other things, because you'll figure it out as you go. A lot of people think that improv is the thing where you have to be, funny, clever, interesting, quick-witted, but actually, it's the opposite of the truth. Is just be calm, be obvious, and the more kind of relaxed you can be, the more likely you are to be able to be off the cuff and say the first thing that comes to mind without that sense of tension. And then it kind of comes full circle, doesn't it? I think like the more relaxed you are and the less you try, you come all the way around the universe and back to the start, and it does become funny, clever, interesting, witty, and all of those things. But that's the difficulty with new students coming into an improv class, is that's their fear, that they are going to be asked to do the product of improv, particularly if what they've seen is short form improv, which does look exactly like that, and is like a joke a minute effectively. But to get to that place, actually there's a kind of a mindfulness journey in order to get to that. I'm really fond of improv wisdom that could go on a t-shirt slogan as well. I try to put it in stupid kind of bite-sized things like that.
Right.
What was the one that I used the other day in the two classes? Oh yeah, that was it. Do you remember the one of the analogies?
I remember a lot of analogies.
Yeah. Oh yes, lots of. I'm fond of a tenuous analogy. Yeah, this was I'll start it and you finish it, which is that improv is like a fart. If you push it,
it's probably shit.
Yay.
Hey, toilet humor.
Yeah, all the time.
Yeah. Wait, but that reminds me of something that you mentioned earlier in the conversation, which was Keith Johnstone's The Right Answer Generator. Yeah. What is the right answer generator? I feel like I have the wrong answer to it.
The right answer generator is, according to Keith, and apologies Keith if I paraphrase this poorly, is that, I suppose he can't do anything now, can he? Is the version of yourself that is created in a school classroom by the pressures of education and teaching, and having to look like you have the right answer. And I think in Keith's book, he has an example of a student at the kind of the back of the class. They don't know the answer to a particular problem the teacher is posing, but they know they're going to get told off if they don't look like they're trying to have the right answer. And that there is this idea that we shouldn't project failure or confusion and all of the rest of it. We should sit there, we should put our hands up as if we know the answer, or we should nod and say, yeah, I do know what's going on, which is obviously antithetical to learning, because if I don't know the answer, I should be able to look at the teacher and say, I don't know. So the right answer generator is that part of yourself who's like, I should look like I know what I'm doing. I guess it kind of equates to like imposter syndrome and lots of things like that in my mind. Feeling like we have to get it right first time. Well, we both know that improv is now becoming really popular in like the business world as a training mechanism. And depending on the industry, there's a huge kind of pressure to whatever, like the deliverable has to be right the first time. But well, how can we innovate then? And so I think lots of these sort of Silicon Valley companies and so on are using a lot of improv because it's so popular in the United States that it's part of their kind of culture to be like, oh yes, the way in which we innovate is to allow ourselves to fail. Which reminds me of another T-shirt quote of improv. So I think I think I actually saw this in a classroom once, and it was the word fail as an acronym, and I completely believed that, oh yeah, is fail an acronym? And it stood for first attempt in learning, which I thought was at the time incredibly cheesy, but also like there's a cuteness and a truth to that. So now in my head, my head canon is fail is not a word, it's an acronym. Yeah.
Just like NPI is an acronym.
Hey, is that when we go to a break for the sponsors?
Yes.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. No pressure, just let it flow. ImproVoice with NPI.
Thank you so much for having me, Shreya, and thank you so much,
here.
NPI, whatever it stands for. Thank you.
Thank you for being here with us, Jonah. And we have officially ended our auditory debut.